The silence between stars had always felt peaceful to David Reed until today, when it carried the weight of someone's desperate cry for help. His fingers moved across the control panel of the exploration vessel Horizon as the distress signal grew stronger with each passing minute. A strange mix of frequencies that his ship's computer struggled to decode, but clearly came from something in terrible trouble. "Sir, we're picking up the source," called Amy from her position at the scanner station, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the ship's engines. "It's about 2 kilometers ahead, drifting near the outer ring of that gas giant." David leaned forward in his chair, studying the swirling purple and gold bands of the massive planet that dominated their view screen. Somewhere in its shadow lay whatever or whoever had sent that signal across the void. "What kind of vessel are we dealing with?" he asked, though part of him already suspected they weren't about to encounter anything familiar. "That's the strange part," Amy replied, adjusting her controls as new data flowed across her screen. "It's small, maybe the size of our emergency pods, but the hull composition doesn't match anything in our databases. And sir, there are definitely life signs aboard. The word definitely hung in the air like a challenge to everything David thought he knew about their corner of the galaxy. They were supposed to be alone out here, charting systems that had never known the touch of intelligence, yet something was calling to them in the universal language of distress. "Bring us closer," David ordered, feeling his pulse quicken as their ship moved toward whatever awaited them in the planet's shadow. "And keep all scanners active. I want to know what we're dealing with before we make contact." The Horizon drifted forward through space, its lights cutting through the darkness until their screens revealed what looked like a metallic seed pod tumbling slowly through the void. Its surface was cracked and scorched, with what appeared to be emergency lights flickering weakly along its damaged hull. "Life support is failing over there," reported Sam from the engineering station, his voice tight with urgency. "Whatever's inside has maybe an hour of breathable air left." If that, David felt the familiar weight of command settle on his shoulders as he realized they were about to make first contact under the worst possible circumstances. Whoever was trapped in that damaged pod was dying, and he was the only one who could save them. "Prepare the docking bay," he said, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. "We're bringing them aboard." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of careful maneuvering as the Horizon's mechanical arms gently captured the alien pod and drew it into their cargo bay. David watched through the security cameras as his crew worked to establish a safe connection between the pod's damaged airlock and their own systems. "Atmosphere is stable," Amy announced as the bay finished pressurizing. "But sir, you should see this. The airlock mechanism is completely different from anything we use, yet somehow our systems are compatible." That detail struck David as odd, but he pushed the thought aside as more pressing concerns demanded his attention. Someone was still trapped inside that pod, and every second counted. He made his way to the cargo bay with Amy and Sam close behind, their footsteps echoing off the metal walls as they approached the alien vessel that now sat silent in their docking cradle. Up close, the pod's hull showed, intricate patterns etched into the metal that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. "The airlock's responding," Sam reported, his hands working over a portable control unit. "But the mechanism is cycling slowly, probably damaged in whatever happened to them out there." David nodded and stepped closer to the pod as mechanical sounds began to echo from within. Whoever was inside was either trying to open the door from their side, or their automated systems were finally responding to the Horizon's attempts at contact. The airlock finally opened with a soft hiss of equalizing pressure, revealing a small chamber filled with what looked like silver mist. And through that mist, David saw her. She was curled in the far corner of the pod's tiny interior, her silver skin catching the light from their cargo bay in ways that made her seem to glow from within. Thin lines of blue radiance traced patterns across her face and arms like living tattoos, pulsing weakly with each breath she took. Her eyes opened as the fresh air from the Horizon reached her, revealing irises that shifted between deep violet and pale gold as she tried to focus on the 3 humans standing before her pod. She appeared young, maybe in her early 20s by human standards, though David had no idea how alien physiology might affect such estimates. "Help," she whispered, the word barely audible but unmistakably human in its pronunciation. "Please help." David stepped forward without thinking, his instincts as both a ship's captain and a decent human being overriding any concerns about first contact protocols. This being, whatever her species, was clearly injured and afraid. She tried to stand as he approached, but collapsed immediately, her legs unable to support her weight as she fell against the pod's interior wall. That was when David saw the damage that had been hidden by the silver mist. Dark stains covered her clothing, and several of the glowing blue lines on her skin flickered erratically where they intersected with what were clearly wounds. Someone or something had hurt her badly before she'd escaped in this damaged pod. "Amy, get medical supplies," David ordered as he knelt beside the pod's entrance, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Sam, help me get her to the medical bay." The alien girl's eyes fixed on David's face as he reached toward her, and he saw something in her expression that transcended species barriers. Desperate hope mixed with terror, as if she couldn't quite believe that help had actually come. "Safe," she managed to say, the word coming out with a slight accent that made it sound almost musical. "You make safe?" "Yes," David replied, gently supporting her as Sam moved to help lift her from the pod. "You're safe now. We won't let anything hurt you." Tears began to flow down her silver cheeks as they carefully carried her toward the medical bay, each drop catching the ship's lights like liquid starlight. But it wasn't until they had her settled on the medical table that she spoke the words that would change everything. "Home," she whispered, her gold and violet eyes locking onto David's with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Please, you follow me home. They all need." Her voice trailed off as the medical scanner began its work, but her eyes remained fixed on David's face with a desperate plea that seemed to reach straight into his heart. Somewhere out there was her home, her people, and they needed help just as desperately as she did. As the medical systems worked to stabilize her condition, David found himself making a promise that would lead them all into darkness they couldn't imagine. He would follow her home, no matter what they might find there. The alien girl smiled weakly before the sedatives took effect, and David noticed that even unconscious, tears continued to flow down her silver cheeks, as if some deep sorrow followed her even into sleep. 3 days passed before she could sit up without help, and when she did, the first thing she reached for was a drawing pad that Amy had brought her from the ship's supplies. Her name was Aria, or at least, that was the closest human pronunciation of the musical sequence of tones she made when David asked her to introduce herself. She had learned their language from radio signals that had somehow reached her world, piecing together words and phrases from broadcasts that had traveled across impossible distances. "My people," she said, her voice gaining strength as her wounds slowly healed under their medical care. "We study stars, learn from light that comes from far away. Your words, your songs, they teach us about humans." David watched her work on her drawings, fascinated by the graceful movements of her hands as she sketched scenes from her homeworld, cities that seemed to float among the clouds, connected by bridges of light that arced between towering crystal spires. "It looks beautiful," Amy commented, looking over Arya's shoulder at a particularly detailed drawing of what appeared to be a vast library filled with beings similar to herself. "How many of your people live there?" Arya's expression darkened, and the blue patterns on her skin flickered more rapidly as if responding to her emotional state. "Many lived there," she corrected, her grammar still imperfect but her meaning clear. "Before they came, before everything changed." She turned to a fresh page and began sketching something different, dark, angular shapes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, moving through space like mechanical predators hunting among the stars. "These ships came to our world 6 cycles ago," she explained, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "They took my family first, then others. Always others, until so few remained." David felt a chill run down his spine as he studied the alien vessels in her drawing. There was something deeply unsettling about their design, as if they had been built by minds that viewed destruction as an art form. What did they want? He asked, though he suspected the answer would be something terrible. Aria's golden eyes filled with tears again as she continued drawing, adding smaller figures being led away from the crystal cities toward waiting ships. They take our people, for work, for experiments, for things I cannot say in your language because the words are too painful. Sam leaned against the medical bay wall, his arms crossed as he studied Aria's sketches with growing concern. These raiders, slavers, whatever, are they still on your world? The question made Aria's entire body tremble, and she dropped her drawing pad as fresh tears began to flow down her silver cheeks. I do not know, she admitted. I escaped when they came for the last group, hid in emergency pod until you found me. But others, my friends, my teachers, they might still be alive. David found himself drawn to one particular sketch that showed Aria's people working together on some kind of massive scientific instrument that seemed to focus starlight into brilliant beams. Their technology appeared far advanced beyond anything humanity had achieved, yet their society seemed peaceful, dedicated to learning rather than conquest. Your people were researchers? He asked, pointing to the instrument in her drawing. Yes, Aria replied, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. We learned how stars are born, how they live and die. We could make them sing to us, tell us their secrets. But we never hurt anything, never took what was not given freely. The contrast between her people's apparent gentleness and the brutal efficiency of their attackers made David's anger burn brighter. Whoever had done this to Aria's world represented everything humanity had sworn to oppose as they explored the galaxy. The coordinates you gave us, he said, checking his wrist display. We're about 2 days away from reaching your system. What should we expect to find there? Aria's expression brightened with desperate hope, and she grabbed David's hand with surprising strength. You will truly come with me? She asked. You will help my people if any still live? Yes, David replied without hesitation, though he noticed Sam and Amy exchange worried looks behind Aria's back. We'll do everything we can. That evening, as Aria rested in the medical bay, David called a meeting in the ship's small conference room to discuss their situation with his crew. The mood was tense as they gathered around the metal table, each lost in their own thoughts about what they might be walking into. I don't like it, Sam said bluntly, breaking the silence that had settled over them. We're flying blind into a system that might still be crawling with hostile forces based on the word of someone we found drifting in an escape pod. Amy nodded reluctantly, though David could see the conflict in her expression. She seems genuine, she said, but Sam's right about the risks. If those raiders are still in her system, the horizon isn't equipped for a fight. So we just leave her people to die? David asked, his voice sharper than he'd intended. We turn around and pretend we never found her? That's not what we're saying, Sam replied, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. But we need to be smart about this. Maybe we should contact the colonial fleet, get proper military support before we go charging in. David stood and walked to the conference room's small viewport, staring out at the stars that lay between them and Aria's homeworld. By the time we get help and return, anyone who might still be alive will be long gone. He said, this is probably their only chance. The debate continued for another hour, with valid arguments on both sides, but David found his mind repeatedly returning to the image of Aria's tears and the desperate hope in her eyes when he'd promised to help. Some decisions couldn't be made purely on tactical considerations. The next day brought them to the edge of Aria's star system, and she practically pressed herself against the bridge viewport as familiar constellations came into view. Her excitement was infectious, causing even Sam to smile as she pointed out landmarks among the distant stars. There, she said, indicating a small blue star that glowed with unusual brightness. That is our sun, and the third world that circles it is my home. We called it Kithra, which means Song of Light in our language. David activated the long-range scanners as they approached, hoping for some indication of what they might find. The system appeared quiet from this distance, with no obvious signs of the raider fleet, that had devastated Arya's world. "I'm not picking up any large vessels," Amy reported from her station, "but there's definitely something artificial orbiting the third planet. Looks like space stations or possibly defensive platforms." Arya's expression grew puzzled as she studied the scanner readings. "Those are not ours," she said with certainty. "My people built nothing like that. We preferred to keep our cities on the ground, among the living things that grew there." The mystery deepened as they drew closer to Kythera, revealing a world of stunning beauty marred by subtle signs of wrongness. The crystal cities Arya had drawn were indeed there, floating among the clouds exactly as she had described, but no lights shone from their windows. "It's like looking at a grave," Amy whispered, and David had to agree with her assessment. Kythera appeared to be a world caught in the moment between life and death, beautiful, but utterly silent. Arya began to tremble as the full scope of the devastation became clear, and David moved to place a comforting hand on her shoulder. Whatever they found on the surface, he knew it would be worse than anything she had been able to prepare herself for. The horizon began its descent through Kythera's atmosphere, carrying them toward answers that none of them were ready to face. The surface of Kythera stretched beneath them like a broken dream made real. Vast forests of bioluminescent trees that should have glowed with soft rainbow light stood dark and lifeless, their crystalline branches reaching toward a sky that seemed too quiet for a living world. Arya pressed her face against the viewport as the horizon descended toward the largest of the floating cities, her silver skin pale with shock as she took in the scope of what had happened to her home. "The singing trees," she whispered. "They are silent. They have been silent for so long." David guided their ship toward what appeared to be a landing platform near the city's center, noting how the crystal structures seemed to pulse with their own inner light despite the absence of any obvious inhabitants. The architecture was unlike anything he had ever seen. Organic curves blended seamlessly with geometric precision. "Atmosphere is breathable," Amy reported from her station. "Gravity is slightly lighter than Earth normal, and I'm not detecting any immediate toxins or pathogens. But sir, I'm also not detecting any life signs anywhere in the city." The silence that greeted this announcement was heavier than the ship's hull, and David saw Arya's shoulders shake as she struggled not to break down completely. She had hoped that some of her people might have survived, hidden somewhere in the crystal spires of their floating home. "Maybe they're deeper in the city," Sam suggested gently, "or in underground shelters we can't scan from here. We won't know until we search." Arya nodded eagerly at this possibility, wiping away fresh tears as she turned to face David with renewed determination. "Yes," she said, "there are many places to hide in the deep chambers where we kept our most important research. If anyone survived, that is where they would go." The landing was smooth despite the alien design of the platform, and within minutes they were walking through an airlock that somehow recognized their ship's systems and provided a perfect seal. Another small mystery to add to the growing list of strange coincidences, the city's central plaza spread before them like something from a fever dream, with towering spires of living crystal that hummed softly in harmonies that seemed to respond to their footsteps. But despite the beauty of their surroundings, the emptiness was overwhelming. "Where is everyone?" Amy asked, her voice echoing off the crystal walls as they followed Arya deeper into the city. "This place is huge. There should be thousands of people here." Arya led them through winding pathways that seemed to glow brighter as she approached, as if the city itself recognized her presence and was trying to welcome her home. But the welcome felt hollow when there was no one else there to share it. They found the first signs of interrupted life in what appeared to be a residential district, where crystalline homes stood open to reveal meals half-finished on elegant tables that seemed grown rather than built. Personal belongings lay scattered as if their owners had simply vanished in the middle of their daily routines. "It's like they all just disappeared," Sam observed, examining a child's toy that still glowed with soft blue light. No signs of struggle, no bodies, nothing to indicate what happened to them. David noticed something else that made his skin crawl. The level of technology visible in even the simplest homes was far beyond what Arya had described during her recovery on the horizon. Control Panels that responded to thought, furniture that adapted to its users' needs, and artwork that moved and changed as they watched. "Aria," he said carefully, not wanting to upset her further but needing answers. "You told us your people were researchers, but this technology, it's incredibly advanced, beyond anything you mentioned before." Her golden eyes flickered with something that might have been guilt before she looked away, focusing on a memorial wall covered with images of beings similar to herself. "We were always modest about our achievements," she said quietly. "My people believed that knowledge should serve life, not dominate." Yet they continued deeper into the city, finding more evidence of sophisticated technology at every turn. Transportation tubes that had carried people between districts at incredible speeds, communication networks that could apparently reach across star systems, and scientific instruments that made David's head spin just looking at them. "This is a Type 2 civilization at minimum," Amy whispered to David when Arya was out of earshot. "Maybe even approaching Type 3. They could harness the energy of entire star systems, yet she described them like they were simple researchers." The discrepancy bothered David more with each discovery, but he pushed his concerns aside as they followed Arya to what she called the Deep Archives, a vast underground complex that housed her people's most important scientific work. The journey down took them through transport tubes that activated automatically, carrying them past level after level of research facilities that would have been the envy of any human scientist. But like everything else on Cathera, they stood empty and silent. "Here," Arya said as they emerged into a cathedral-sized chamber, filled with what appeared to be star charts that moved and shifted in 3 dimensions. "This is where my teachers worked, where I learned to listen to the songs of distant suns." David stared in amazement at displays that showed the structure of galaxies in real time, with streams of data flowing between points of light like cosmic neural networks. The scale of knowledge represented here was staggering, but it was Sam who noticed the detail that changed everything. A section of the star charts that focused on a familiar yellow star surrounded by 8 planets, with detailed information about the third world's inhabitants. "Arya," Sam called out, his voice tight with sudden tension. "Why do your people have detailed files on Earth and humanity?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and David saw Arya's entire body go rigid as she turned to face them. The innocent confusion in her expression looked genuine, but something about her posture suggested she had been dreading. "This moment I do not understand," she said, but her voice lacked the conviction it had carried before. "Perhaps the archives collected information about many worlds." David moved closer to the Earth display, reading data that included details about human biology, technology levels, and even cultural patterns that should have been impossible for distant observers to obtain. "This isn't just collected information," he said slowly. "This is the kind of detailed intelligence you'd gather if you were planning something." Amy joined them at the display, her face pale as she read through files that cataloged human weaknesses, resource locations, and strategic infrastructure. "Arya," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what were your people planning to do with this information?" The silver-skinned girl began to back away from them, her golden eyes wide with what looked like genuine terror. But David couldn't tell if she was afraid of them or afraid of what they might discover. "You do not understand," Arya repeated, her musical voice cracking with emotion. "My people, we would never hurt anyone. We only studied, only learned." But even as she spoke, more displays activated around them, showing detailed schematics for weapons that could drain the energy from entire star systems, turning them into cold, dead husks, while channeling their power to fuel impossible technologies. The beautiful crystal city above them suddenly felt like the monument to a lie, and David realized that everything Arya had told them about her people might have been carefully crafted to hide a truth too terrible to face. "The raiders who attacked your world," David said, his voice steady despite the growing horror of what he was beginning to understand. What if they weren't raiders at all? Arya's silver skin began to shimmer with patterns of distress as the implications of his question sank in, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "What if they were trying to stop us?" The elevator shaft descended for what felt like hours through layers of Kythera's crust, carrying them toward the planet's core, where Arya claimed the most sensitive research had been conducted in absolute secrecy. David watched the depth readings climb on his scanner as they plunged deeper into the world, noting how the elevator's crystalline walls grew thicker and more complex the further down they went. Whatever lay at the bottom had been built to withstand incredible forces. "How deep does this go?" Sam asked, his voice betraying the claustrophobia that was affecting them all as the elevator continued its relentless descent through solid rock. "Deep enough to touch the heart of our world," Arya replied, though her usual musical tone carried undertones of dread that made David's stomach clench with apprehension. "My people believed that some knowledge was too dangerous to keep near the surface where others might find it." Amy checked her instruments again, frowning at readings that defied conventional physics. "The energy signatures down here are unlike anything I've ever seen," she reported. "It's like the planet's core has been artificially modified to generate massive amounts of power." The elevator finally stopped at a depth that put them nearly a quarter of the way to Kythera's center, opening into a vast chamber that stretched beyond the reach of their lights. But as they stepped forward, the space around them began to glow with the same soft radiance that had marked all of the Lumi technology. What they found there shattered every assumption David had made about Arya's people and their supposed peaceful nature. The chamber housed a facility that dwarfed anything humanity had ever constructed, with machinery that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a living heart as it drew energy directly from the planet's molten core. But this was only the beginning of the horror that awaited them. "Welcome to the stellar engine," Arya whispered, her voice heavy with shame as the true scope of her people's work revealed itself in the growing light. "This is where we learn to reach across space and touch the hearts of distant stars." David stared at displays that showed star systems throughout the galaxy, each one marked with detailed information about their energy potential and the civilizations that orbited them. But what made his blood run cold was the status indicator next to each system: harvested, depleted, or scheduled for extraction. "You drain stars," Amy said, her voice flat with disbelief. "You actually drain the energy from entire star systems." "Not drain," Arya corrected, though her golden eyes couldn't meet theirs. "We borrowed their light, used it to power our research and exploration. We always intended to return what we took." Sam moved to one of the control panels, his engineering background helping him understand the horrific elegance of what he was seeing. "This isn't borrowing," he said grimly. "This process destabilizes stellar cores, causing them to collapse decades or centuries ahead of their natural lifespan." The implications hit David like a physical blow as he realized what they were looking at. The Lumi weren't victims of cosmic raiders, they were the raiders, systematically destroying star systems across the galaxy to fuel their own civilization. "How many?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How many star systems have you killed?" Arya's silver skin flickered with patterns of distress as she moved to a central display that showed the true scope of their galactic impact. Hundreds of systems marked as depleted, thousands more in various stages of energy extraction, and a priority list that made David's heart stop. "Sol system," Amy read from the display, her voice cracking as she saw their own sun marked with extraction protocols. "Earth is scheduled for harvest in the next cycle." The betrayal hit David like a knife to the chest as he realized that Arya's rescue hadn't been a coincidence. She had been fleeing toward Earth, possibly to begin the preliminary work that would doom his entire species. "You knew," he said, turning to face Arya with eyes that burned with accusation. "When you begged us to follow you home, you knew what we would find here." Tears began to flow down Arya's silver cheeks again, but now David understood them differently. Not tears of grief for lost family, but tears of guilt for the countless civilizations her people had murdered. "Did not want this," she whispered. "I never wanted any of this, but my people, they believed it was necessary for our survival, for our growth into something greater than biological limitations." Sam discovered another section of the facility that housed records of their previous extractions, complete with documentation of the civilizations that had died when their stars collapsed prematurely. entire species reduced to brief entries in a cosmic ledger of destruction. According to this, they've been doing this for over 50,000 years, Sam reported, his voice hollow with the weight of what he was reading. Millions of inhabited worlds, billions of intelligent beings, all sacrificed to keep this one civilization running. David found himself staring at detailed plans for Earth's harvest. Noting how thoroughly the Lumi had studied human society and technology, they knew about every major city, every military installation, every resource that would be useful during the extraction process. The attacks on your world, David said, pieces of a horrible puzzle finally clicking into place. They weren't random raiders looking for slaves, they were survivors, weren't they? Arya nodded miserably, confirming what David had already begun to suspect. The coalition of lost worlds, she said, refugees from systems we had harvested, species that had managed to escape before their stars died. They finally organized enough to strike back. The justice of it was undeniable, even though David found himself struggling with the implications. The beings who had attacked Cathara were the same ones his crew would have fought to defend the Lumi, making them unwitting allies of genocidal monsters. They came to stop us. Arya continued, her voice breaking as she revealed the full truth. To end the harvesting before we could destroy more worlds. But by then, most of my people had already fled to hidden colonies in other galaxies. Amy discovered the final piece of the puzzle in a sealed section of the facility's memory banks. Detailed plans for a portable version of the stellar engine that could be built using resources from primitive worlds like Earth. That's why you needed us to follow you, Amy said, her voice filled with disgust. You weren't looking for rescue, you were looking for raw materials and slave labor to rebuild your civilization somewhere else. The weight of their situation crashed down on David as he realized how completely they had been manipulated. Arya's tears, her apparent innocence, even her injuries had all been carefully calculated to inspire exactly the kind of heroic response that would bring them here. How long have you been planning this? David asked, though part of him no longer wanted to know the answer. Since the moment I saw your ship on my scanner, Arya admitted, her musical voice now sounding like a funeral dirge. I knew that humans would be perfect for our needs. Intelligent, enough to be useful, but not advanced enough to resist effectively. The silence that followed her confession was broken only by the humming of the stellar engine as it continued its patient work, drawing power from Cathara's dying core to maintain systems that should never have existed. David felt something break inside him as he understood the full scope of what they were facing. Not just personal betrayal, but complicity in a cosmic horror that made humanity nothing more than the next entry in a galactic death ledger. The truth hung between them like poison gas in the sterile air of the core facility, and David found himself studying Arya's face with new eyes that saw manipulation in every tear and calculated deception in every trembling breath. You're not even really injured, are you? Amy asked, her voice cold with the kind of anger that comes from realizing you've been played by an expert. All that medical treatment, the way you could barely stand when we found you. It was all an act. Arya's silver skin seemed to dim as her emotional facade cracked, revealing something harder and more calculating underneath. The injuries were real, she said quietly, but not from fleeing attackers. They came from the Coalition's justice protocols when they processed me for war crimes. The casual way she mentioned war crimes made David's blood run cold, and he realized they had only begun to scratch the surface of who Arya really was. Not a refugee scientist, but something far more dangerous. What did you do? Sam demanded, his engineering mind apparently working through the implications of her words. What specific war crimes are you talking about? Arya moved to another section of the control room, her movements now carrying a confidence that had been absent during her time aboard the Horizon. The helpless victim was gone, replaced by someone who clearly understood exactly how powerful and terrible this facility truly was. I designed the targeting algorithms, she said matter-of-factly, the systems that identified which stars were suitable for harvesting and which civilizations would provide the least resistance during extraction. My work made the process efficient enough to expand beyond our home galaxy. David felt sick as he processed this information, realizing that the person he had risked his crew to save was personally responsible for the deaths of countless billions across multiple galaxies. Her expertise had turned genocide into an industrial process. The Coalition found me guilty of crimes against existence itself, Arya continued, seeming almost relieved to finally tell the truth. They were preparing to execute me when I managed to escape using a prototype personal transport that I had been developing in secret. Amy checked her medical scanner, confirming what they were all beginning to suspect. Your biology, she said slowly. It's not what our scanners initially read, is it? I am older than your species, Arya admitted, her golden eyes now reflecting an ancient intelligence that made David's skin crawl. I have lived for over 2,000 of your years, perfecting the art of stellar destruction, while your people were still learning to make fire. The revelation that she was essentially immortal added another layer of horror to their situation, suggesting that her expertise in manipulation came from centuries of practice on countless unsuspecting victims. Sam discovered security footage from the Coalition's attack on Kythera, and what they saw confirmed their worst fears about who they had really rescued. Arya wasn't running from justice. She was running toward Earth with plans to rebuild her civilization using human resources. You sabotaged your own escape pod, David said, watching the footage of Arya deliberately damaging her transport before setting course for human space. You made it look like you were fleeing in panic when you were actually executing a carefully planned infiltration. I needed to appear vulnerable, Arya explained with the clinical detachment of someone describing a laboratory experiment. Humans respond predictably to beings in distress, especially females who appear young and helpless by your standards. The psychological manipulation went even deeper than David had imagined, and he found himself questioning every emotion he had felt since finding her drifting in space. Had any of it been real, or had she been controlling his responses from the very beginning? The pheromones, Amy said suddenly, checking readings from her portable scanner. You've been releasing chemical signals that affect human brain chemistry, making us more trusting, more protective. Arya nodded without shame, as if she were confirming. A basic scientific principle. Your species is remarkably susceptible to biological influence, she said. A few trace compounds in the air supply, combined with carefully crafted emotional appeals, and most humans will do whatever you ask of them. David felt a rage building inside him that was purer than anything he had ever experienced, not just at the betrayal but at the clinical way she discussed reducing his entire species to lab animals for her manipulation. Even now, Arya continued, you are fighting the biochemical bonds I have created in your minds. The part of you that wants to forgive me to find some way to justify my actions that is not entirely your own thinking. Sam moved away from her, his face pale as he realized how thoroughly their judgment had been compromised. How long have you been affecting us, he asked, since we first brought you aboard? From the moment you opened my escape pod, Arya replied, though the effects became stronger as I recovered and could focus more energy on maintaining the proper chemical balance in your ship's atmosphere. The knowledge that their rescue of her had been orchestrated from the very beginning made David feel like he was drowning in his own naivety. Every noble impulse, every protective instinct had been weaponized against them. The Coalition, David said, grasping for some anchor of truth. In the ocean of lies, they're still hunting you, aren't they? For the first time since her confession began, Arya showed genuine fear as she nodded. They have sworn to pursue every surviving Lumi until our species is extinct, she said. They call it the final justice, and they will never stop looking. For me, Amy discovered communication logs that showed just how close that pursuit had become. Coalition forces had been tracking Arya's escape route and were less than a day behind the horizon when they arrived at Kythera. They're coming here, Amy announced, her voice tight with tension. According to these readings, we have maybe 18 hours before they arrive in this system. The approaching deadline forced David to confront the ultimate question that had been building since they discovered the truth. What did they do with someone guilty of cosmic genocide who had manipulated them into becoming unwitting accomplices? You still need us, David said, studying Arya's expression as he worked through the logic of their situation. That's why you're telling us the truth now, because you need our help to escape the coalition. Yes, Arya admitted simply, and in return I can offer you something your species has never possessed. The knowledge to transcend your planetary limitations and become a truly galactic civilization. The offer hung in the air like a temptation designed to exploit humanity's greatest weakness, the desire to grow, to explore, to become something greater than what they were. Using the same technology that murdered billions, Sam said flatly, powered by the deaths of entire star systems. Evolution requires sacrifice, Arya replied, her voice carrying the cold certainty of someone who had justified atrocity so many times that it had become routine. Your species could rule galaxies, could live forever among the stars. All it requires is the wisdom to take what you need from those too weak to defend it. David realized that this was the final test, the moment when humanity would choose what kind of species they wanted to become, and the choice they made would determine not just their own fate, but potentially the fate of every other civilization they might encounter. The sound of alarm suddenly filled the facility, as proximity sensors detected ships dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. The coalition had arrived ahead of schedule, and now everyone aboard the Horizon would be forced to face the consequences of their choices. The coalition fleet materialized at the edge of Cathera's system like avenging angels wreathed in starfire. Their ships bearing the scars of 1,000 battles fought across dead worlds in pursuit of justice that had been delayed for far too long. David watched the tactical display as dozens of vessels moved into formation around the planet, each one representing a different species that had survived the Lumi harvest of their home systems. The diversity of their alliance spoke to the scope of Arya's people's crimes. Attention, human vessel, came a transmission that cut through every communication channel on the horizon. This is Commander Naya of the Coalition ship Remembrance. You are harboring a war criminal wanted for crimes against existence itself. The voice carried an authority that seemed to reach across space and demand attention, its alien accent doing nothing to diminish the power of words spoken by someone who had seen too much death. Arya moved to the facility's communication array, her movements now sharp and purposeful as she abandoned any pretense of helplessness. Commander Naya, she replied, how persistent you have become in your pursuit of justice. Arya of the 73rd Harvest, Naya responded, using what David realized must be Arya's true name and rank. You stand accused of designing the algorithms that murdered the populations of 847 star systems. Surrender now and face judgment. The number hit David like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the true scale of what the being he had tried to save had accomplished during her long lifetime. Nearly 1,000 civilizations wiped from existence because of her expertise. I offer the humans something their species has never possessed. Arya transmitted back, the knowledge to transcend their limitations and join the galactic community as equals rather than prey. David felt the chemical influence she had maintained over his crew beginning to fade as emergency systems purged the Horizon's atmosphere, allowing him to think clearly for the first time since they had rescued her from that escape pod. What exactly are you offering them? Naya asked, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had heard similar promises before. The same gifts you offered the Centauri before you drained their binary stars? Amy discovered historical records of the Centauri in the facility's database, learning about a peaceful trading civilization that had welcomed the Lumi as friends before watching their entire species die when their suns collapsed decades ahead of schedule. The Centauri were weak, Arya replied without emotion. They lacked the vision to use the power I offered them effectively. Humans are different, stronger, more adaptable to the realities of galactic politics. Sam found tactical displays showing how the Coalition had tracked every surviving Lumi across multiple galaxies, pursuing them with the single-minded determination of beings who had lost everything to stellar genocide. David Reed of the human vessel Horizon, Naya transmitted directly, you have a choice to make that will determine your species' future relationship with the galactic community. Will you stand with justice or with those who would make you complicit in cosmic murder? The weight of that choice settled on David's shoulders like the gravity of a dying star, forcing him to confront everything he thought he knew about right and wrong, in a universe far more complex than humanity had imagined. She manipulated us, David found himself saying into the comm system, used pheromones and emotional manipulation to make us trust her. We had no idea what she really was. I am aware of Lumi manipulation techniques, Naya replied, her voice carrying a note of understanding. Many coalition species fell victim to similar deceptions before we learned to recognize them. The question now is what you choose to do with the truth. Arya turned to face David, her golden eyes still beautiful despite everything he now knew about her. You can still choose power, she said softly. I can teach your species to harvest energy from stars, to live forever among the galaxies, to become something greater than the limitations of your biology. The temptation was real. David realized, even without her chemical influence, the promise of transcendence, of becoming a galactic power, of lifting humanity beyond the constraints that had bound them to a single world. At the cost of how many other civilizations? Amy asked, her voice cutting through Arya's seductive promises. How many other species would we have to murder to fuel this transcendence? Evolution requires sacrifice, Arya repeated, using the same justification she had probably given to hundreds of other species before leading them down the path to cosmic destruction. The strong survive by taking what they need from the weak. David found himself thinking about Earth, about the billions of humans who had no idea their entire species was being offered a choice between damnation and justice. They would never know how close they had come to becoming cosmic monsters. Commander Naya, David said into the comm system, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. Arya is yours. We won't stand in the way of justice. The scream of rage that escaped Arya's throat was unlike anything human vocal cords could produce, a sound of fury and betrayal that seemed to resonate through the crystalline structure of the facility itself. You choose extinction, she snarled, her beautiful features twisting into something alien and terrible. When the Coalition decides humanity is too dangerous to survive, remember that you could have chosen power instead. Coalition boarding shuttles reached the surface of Cathara within hours, their crews moving with the precision of beings who had performed this operation many times before. David watched through security cameras as they methodically secured the facility commander. Naya herself came to collect Arya, revealing herself to be a being of living crystal whose homeworld had been among the first systems the Lumi had harvested. Her transparent form contained swirling galaxies of light that David realized were probably the preserved memories of her dead civilization. Your species has chosen wisely, Naya told David, as Coalition forces led Arya away in restraints that seemed to be made of crystallized starlight. The path she offered leads only to becoming the very evil you sought to oppose. What happens to her now? David asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. She will face the justice of 847 dead civilizations, Naya replied, and then she will join her people in ensuring that the Lumi legacy of stellar genocide ends, forever. As the Coalition fleet departed with their prisoner, David found himself standing alone in the ruins of Arya's crystalline city, surrounded by the monuments to a civilization that had chosen power over compassion and paid the ultimate price. The journey back to Earth took weeks, during which David and his crew struggled to process what they had experienced and the choice they had been forced to make. They had saved their species by condemning someone who had trusted them, and the moral complexity of that decision would haunt them forever. You think we made the right choice? Amy asked during one of their long discussions about what had happened. I think we made the only choice we could live with, David replied, staring out at the stars that seemed different now that he knew how many had been murdered to fuel alien ambitions. And sometimes that's all the certainty we get. When they finally reached Earth and made their report, David found himself wondering if humanity would have been strong enough to resist Arya's temptations if they had been offered them under different circumstances. The capacity for both great, good and terrible evil seemed to be built into the very fabric of intelligence itself. The story of their encounter became classified at the highest levels, but David knew that someday humanity would face similar choices as they expanded into the galaxy. And he could only hope that when that time came, they would remember the lesson of Cathara and choose justice over power. In the end, David realized, the measure of a civilization wasn't what it could take from others, but what it was willing to sacrifice to remain worthy of the stars themselves. And that was a test humanity had passed, if only barely, and only because they had been forced to see the alternative reflected in the tears of a monster who had almost convinced them she was an angel.